In the next series of modules, we are going to get started by covering components. And think of a component as just a building block of a user interface or a layout. A layout or user interface is really just a collection of components that have been pieced together seamlessly. So when we've been learning all about the UI design fundamentals, we need to start with the very most fundamental building blocks before we get into designing full layouts, which again is just composed and comprised of various components. So this most basic component that I could personally think of is a button. All right, so a button, it's just something that somebody can click on with their mouse if they're on desktop, or they can actually tap on with their finger if they're on a device like a tablet or a phone. And sometimes you're going to hear the term call to action. And a call to action is a prominent button that really demands importance. It doesn't have to be a button. It could be different things. But a button can be a call to action. And we'll see that and we'll hear that term going forward. But for now, I just want to examine buttons alone without any other context of any other user interface elements. And the important thing to remember here is the UI design fundamentals that we've been following along and learning, they all apply to even the smallest component. All right, so there's not much that separates a button from a full user interface when we're talking about UI design fundamentals. So your UI design fundamentals, they apply from the smallest element like a button all the way to the very biggest element of a full complete user interface. So I want to talk about the various types of buttons here, and I'll provide a number of examples. I'm going to provide you with the most simple button. That's what we're going to start with. So what does the most simple button look like? Well, from my opinion, the most simple button is that right there. It just says visit our store. It's just text. So a button doesn't necessarily have to have a container around it or anything like that. It doesn't have to be fancy. And I want to provide context with all these examples. So what I'm going to do is when I create this, we're going to duplicate it and we're going to bring it down here in the context of maybe like a very simple design where we have a headline, a description, and then a call to action, or like a button in this case, just to show you what it looks like. Now in this case, it says visit our store, and maybe we're gonna make this a little bit smaller. So let me scale this down just a bit, maybe to 18. And likewise, we will do 18 here as well. And let's say for instance, we want this to be the button. Now in and of itself, it's styled exactly the same as the description. So if we were to have an extremely simple button like this without a container of sorts, then I would probably either make it bold. Again, this is all about visual hierarchy, or I would change the color. So let's just change the color here to maybe like a mid-tone sort of bluish. I think right there works pretty well. Now the one thing I want you to get in the habit of is make sure when you're here in Figma, or this could be Adobe XD or any other app that has plugins, that we use the stark contrast or any of the other type of contrast checker to make sure it adheres to those WCAG contrast guidelines. So again, if you don't have stark, the plugin, go to browse plugins, just type in stark and then install it and come back. So we're going to choose, first we're going to select this element. We're going to go to our plugins, go to stark, and check contrast. All right, so right here, we adhere to at least the AA normal text guidelines of 6.14. So it needs to be at least 4.5 for this to be an effective contrast. So that works very well. So that's a very simple button. Clearly, it's separated visually because of the color, and people would click it. So let's take a look at another type of button. We're just going to duplicate this over here. And this time we're going to wrap a container around it. All right, so we're going to take this button, or this the rectangle tool rather, and we're going to, here in the layers, just drag it down. And now we can see it, and we can use our keyboard arrow keys to position it, and you'll see these different guidelines show up when you're positioning elements. And we want to make sure it's just center, and you could also select the text and do the same thing as well. Just make sure things are centered up here. And let's go ahead and use that same color for the fill. All right, so in this case, do we have enough contrast? So important. So let's select both of these elements. We'll go to our plugins, Stark, and check contrast. And it says it's a AA for large text. What is large text? If we click this little element, I'm not sure if you can see it, but I can read it. It says passing color results are accurate only if your font is at least 18.66 pixels with bold weight or 24 pixels. So right now our text is only 18 pixels here. So this technically would not pass if we have both of these because it's only 3.4. So what if we made it white, the text white? Select both of them and now they pass. All right, so always get in the habit of checking them. What if you had like a lighter gray? So let me duplicate this. Or not a gray, but a blue rather. And so let's change this to maybe right around here. Now let's check both of these. This doesn't pass, it's only 3.28. What if we change this then, the text to black? Now this passes, 6.38. So hopefully you can see what I'm getting at. If you have a lighter color background, then you're gonna make sure you need to make sure you're using a darker contrasting color that gets you at least to 4.5 to 1 contrast ratio if you're at normal text size, or 3 to 1 if you're at larger and or bold. Okay, so at this point, we'll just choose a color going forward that we know will work so we can demonstrate these different properties. So right here, in terms of UI design fundamentals, if we're looking just at the single button component, they all work out. All right, they all seem to work like everything's even up. We have even white space all around, so it's consistently applied. Oh, and by the way, to check that might be interesting for us to check this sort of thing. If we're selecting this element and we hold Alt, then if we hold Alt and we move our mouse over to adjacent areas, it'll let us know the amount of padding or the white space between our elements. Now with text, it's a little bit tricky because it depends on the actual text container. So if I pull this up, it's not really representative of the text itself that's being centered. So just understand that. And we can bring this down a bit. And that is pretty much centered right there with equal white space. So again, going back to all the various fundamentals, visual hierarchy here wouldn't really apply for a button because it's just itself and the container. We also have typography. Again, we're using the same font all throughout. It's a good scale as well. We can read it because it's 18. So everything's working out here in terms of the UI design fundamentals. Let's duplicate this and we'll come out with another example of a different type of button. And again, there's not a huge change here. If we zoom up with Control and the mouse wheel, we could drag these in and just to create a rounded corners button. And you could also adjust it up here in the property inspector, the corner radius. And if you wanted to adjust all 4 angles, you can click this little icon there and then just the top, right, left, bottom, independent of each other. So now we have a few different buttons, and let's go over here and duplicate this just so we can get more of a visual understanding of what's happening here. So we'll copy this, we'll paste that. We could put this one perhaps right there. All right, looks good. Of course, when it comes to these call to actions, which one do you think might draw more attention? This one or this one? Clearly, the container itself demands more attention from the eye because when compared with the white background, of course, it contrasts a lot more. So it will draw more attention. Let's duplicate this. We'll delete that one right here. We'll copy this. You can see these are just minute differences. Let's get that down here. So the decision of whether or not to have just completely right angle corners or rounded borders really is a subjective preference, and it depends on your user interface. But if you do have rounded corners or everything is just a right angle here, then make sure you apply it consistently throughout your UI design. All right, let's look at another example. So this is a more extreme example. It's called a pill container, where we just take the border radius and we drag it, or rather, let's undo that. There we go. Now we can just drag this in all the way, and it's called a pill because it looks like a pill. All right, very simple. And this dragging in the pill container, it kind of closes in the aspect of the button, so there's not a lot of white space from here. So you might want to hold Alt and just drag out so we can create a little bit more white space on the right and left. And again, we can duplicate this just to see how this interacts and what this looks like. And again, nothing exciting or major is happening here. We're just dealing with basic UI design. Now, what about another option that we have? All right, so we can duplicate that. We'll move this over. This time we can have an outline style button. So let's go ahead and get rid of that. We'll give it a stroke. All right, so now because we got rid of the background, it's white, let's go ahead and give this a specific color. We'll give it a fill of black for the text. We could leave this black if we wish, or we can use the same color here. All right. Again, that works in and of itself. So let's see what that looks like. All right, so it's similar to the other one in that it doesn't demand as much attention from the eye compared to these three here, but it's just another aesthetic. And for the most part, it's just a subjective preference in terms of how you're choosing to style your buttons. All right, let's do another one. We'll duplicate this over here. Sometimes if you have several different buttons, or if you just choose to take this approach, we can have an icon. So another great plugin that we'll be using a lot is called Iconify. Iconify. So go ahead to browse plugins and install the Iconify plugin. We're going to select it. It allows us to search for a ton of different plugins. So let's just type store, find icons, or plugins, I meant icons rather. And we'll just choose one of these store icons. So we'll just drag it, left click and drag, close this out, and we can place this in here and scale it with Shift Alt a little bit. Get it aligned up pretty good. Good. Now remember, when I'm placing this, I'm making sure there's good amount of white space all around it, consistent, accurate amount of white space. It's not too close, for instance. It's not too close to this side, for instance, or it's not misaligned up. We're trying to make sure everything is nice and consistently aligned when we create these. And so again, this is perfectly fine as well if you want to have an accompanying icon. So we're going to copy that, drag that here, and there we go. So as you can see, we have so many options when it concerns the buttons that we use. Now we can also have more. All right, there's another one, another type of button. One that's only based on an icon. So we could take this, drag this in. Typically you would probably, if you're gonna have a perfect circle, just use the ellipse tool. So we can drag this down here, choose ellipse or O on your keyboard shortcut, and then come out in the center, Shift Alt, left click and drag up. And that way we make sure we have an actual perfect circle, because I guarantee that's not. Now we can drag this over here, right click, send to back is a way to order layers without having to do it manually over here. Get this centered up. Again, get our aesthetic that we had, add the stroke, and choose our color. And then maybe we want to change this icon color, which you can do as well with the Iconify icons. And there we go. An icon-based outline button. And then finally, there was one more type of button that I thought I would mention. I'm going to duplicate this one. And then there's buttons that have just a different style, maybe trendy type of underline, or just like a grungy background behind it, just to be a little bit more, I guess you could say, unique or artistic with it. So we can use the pen tool and we can kind of create an interesting sort of underline. Maybe like that. And then we can change the stroke here, color. Maybe we can bold this up. And just like that. So As you can see, buttons come in all different shapes and sizes. And there's also a lot more to be said about buttons. For instance, we want to make sure that when we design for buttons that we also create a design for their different states. So when somebody hovers over them, what does the button change? What does it look like? When somebody clicks on one and it's focused, what happens then? So these are all things that we will eventually get to when we get to the prototyping section of the curriculum, in the interaction section and the animation section as well. But just to show you, let's do this last one right here. Having simply just this icon, by the way, where there's no accompanying text as a call to action here wouldn't quite make sense in that regard. These are usually relegated for like social media icons and things like that. But we can certainly take this one and we can paste it here. And there we go. Probably want to change this to our color as well to make sure it stands out a little bit more. And there we go. So that's it in a nutshell about buttons. The biggest thing I want you to take away from this video is that every component needs to be looked at from the perspective of making sure every single UI design fundamental is working for it. So contrast, color, typography, scale, all of these things need to be working, especially true for buttons and text that are contained within. So going forward, we're going to take a look at another type of component. Although first we're going to do a few tests, and then we're going to get into the card component, and then we'll get into another exciting challenge where you can put your skills to the test.